Welcome to Truth and Testimony, the broadcast, where we teach and discuss the Word of God. You'll also hear about world news and how it relates to Bible prophecy, plus interviews and testimonials from men and women of God who have devoted their lives to serving Yeshua, Jesus Christ our Lord. Now, without further ado, let's get to our host, Adrian Scott.
Greetings and shalom. Welcome to Truth and Testimony, the broadcast. I am Adrian Scott. I am going to now continue my series, or maybe in some ways I could say begin my series on creation and evolution. In this particular video, I'm going to be discussing Charles Darwin. Now, more than the specific life and events of his life, it's more the influence that he had on the rest of the world. That's more what I'm going to focus on. There are any number of fantastic sources out there that really do kind of go into detail in his past. I will touch on it very loosely just to kind of set some framework. I am not, a research specialist. I am limited in what I have access to. I do try to confirm the information that I do find because, I just want to be as reliable as I can, noting that I am fallible. Taking a look at that, and there's some pretty significant concepts that connect to the works of Charles Darwin. Not the least of which is, and the obvious one, is the mainstream acceptance that his works brought to the theory of evolution. And that's the big one, but it's not limited to that. There's a lot of other things that do kind of trickle down from that. A big one, and one that I am going to passively touch on, is what does, the theory of evolution, and by extension Charles Darwin, have to do with communism. So, this is a loaded topic, and there's always going to be lots of debate and opinions on this one for certain. I again remind everyone that, the first good chunk of my life I was a pretty devout evolutionist, and only when I was about 35, 36 years old did I find my faith. And that it was a big shift in my life. I know I've kind of touched on before the idea of messing around with people's traditions and stuff, when you're talking about stuff like that, when you're discussing those kind of topics, and it really touches on, you're hitting on a real nerve there, and it can be very difficult for people to even just listen to, because you're so ingrained in your ways. It's not just about you being ingrained. This is what you learned from your parents and what they learned from their parents and their parents in some cases. This is a generational thing. We are talking about family ingrained traditions, and in some cases sociological traditions that, if you stray from those things, the immediate effect can be scrutiny and I don't want to say intolerance, but tension with your own family. But also it can be, depending on where you live, it can then create tension and conflict in the society that you live in. So it's a big time thing. And when I made, I kind of talked about the idea of when I shifted from being in a Pentecostal church to being Messianic, and that it wasn't as difficult for me to change some of my traditions as it related to that stuff, because I didn't have in fact, I didn't really have any traditions when it came to Christianity, because I didn't grow up that way. And although my family really has its roots in the Catholic Church, there weren't many that I can think of that were practicing. So it was not a very religiously active family. There were a few, but it was not any part of my childhood, or such a small part it's barely even worth mentioning. So I didn't really come till Christianity till I was around 35-ish. So changing some of those traditions, the example being giving up Easter in favor of Passover and things like that. That wasn't as hard for me. And I do understand how hard it can be for some people that are a lot more entrenched in that kind of thing. Because what was a lot harder for me was giving up my evolutionary believing in becoming a Christian at all. Because that was a major challenge. Because it's like things that I was confident was, I got this figured out. I understand this. It makes sense. It's been proven, so on and so forth. And just to find out that it's not that concrete. And again, I referenced that idea of that article in the magazine where it says, no human being has ever seen a living dinosaur. And then ask the question, does the author know that? Or does he think that? What would it take for him to know that, to definitively make that statement that no human being has ever seen a living dinosaur? He would have to have asked every human being that's ever lived. And since that's not possible, it's his educated opinion that no human being has ever seen a living dinosaur. And had he stated it that way, well, now you're talking about something different. But they're passing something that's not so certain to certain, passing it off as if it is that certain. And that was the big shift for me from evolution to faith. And so what I do know is that evolution plays an enormous part in our world. It's interesting to note that for a lot of human history, evolution was not a thing that was taught. And you can say as we got smarter and we learned more, okay, that could be a part of it. But the reality is that what was predominantly taught in public schools early on was creation. And it wasn't until relatively more recently that evolution kind of found its way in. I think that was really predominantly came on the heels of the Scopes trial. And if you're not familiar with that, I haven't done a ton of research on that one. I don't want to just try to recollect it off the top of my head. So I would encourage you to go kind of look into that one yourself. The Scopes trial, and as it relates to evolution being taught in schools. But I think that's really where it shifted into hardcore into schools to start going with that. And I do think for a while that it was a case where both were kind of taught in tandem, creation and evolution. But it's become a point where creation is no longer taught. And I think it's been said that, well, a lot of people think that you're not allowed to teach creation in school. Apparently, and I haven't confirmed this one, but apparently you can still talk about it and use it as a teaching tool within the proper format and context and everything else, and not to the exclusion of, the other ideas, which frankly is what I teach in my house. I don't limit what I teach my children to being just about God. I mean, I say, okay, here's an alternative. We believe this in this house, and I hope and encourage you to believe the same thing. But ultimately, when my kids get old enough to make that choice, I'm going to let them make that choice. It is their call. I don't dare deny the free will that God has given us by trying to force them to do anything. So anyways, back to that. In the connection to evolution, I do believe, it is really my strong belief, that evolution is responsible for many of the problems that we see in today's world. I think probably the top one that I will touch on is racism. But racism itself is the progenitor of a lot of these other issues. So it's pretty big. It's heady stuff. And again, I really am only going to be doing a cursory kind of overview and sort of a summary of the entire topic. There are some really good resources out there that go into much more depth with documentary proof, biblical scriptures, the whole nine yards. They really get into all of it. I encourage you to do your own searches, look into it for yourself. But at least, whichever way you believe, just try to keep an open mind. Don't be so set that I have all the truth, I don't need to know anything else. I think that's the biggest mistake, whether you're an evolutionist or a creationist, to lock yourself into that box. You're just denying yourself an opportunity to learn things. Nothing saying you have to change your foundational belief system, but be open to at least hearing other opposing ideas. So, and I kind of use the key word there of racism, that it is truly, to me, in my opinion, racism is firmly rooted in evolution. It is not something, I think, that can exist in a biblical worldview. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. So the idea basically is a little bit of history of Charles Darwin, and more particularly some of the books. I mean, we know the main one he did on the origin of species, but other books that he did, and the impact that they had on other parts of the world, and the trickle-down effect that has gone on for years and years. So actually, I mean, right it there, let's talk a little bit about Charles Darwin. So I'm trying to remember now. Use my little reference here. He was born in 1809, passed away in 1882. That's one thing. So his family apparently were Anglican in their tradition, and he was baptized Anglican. But really, it seems like, and I've heard some people say that, he was a Christian and he did this. So he was baptized Anglican. He did go to seminary to study to be clergy. The impression that I get from everything that I looked into is he was always half-hearted with that at best. So it wasn't anything he was ever really fervently behind. He just kind of did it. I get the sense that part of it was out of obligation to his mother. And but it was never anything that he had a real passion for. What he did have a passion for was more processes of change and stuff. And a big influence on him, and he in turn ended up being an influence on that, was Lyell and his work in geology. But that steered him even further away from Christianity, more towards that evolutionary viewpoint. And it seems like it was the death of his 10-year-old daughter, Annie, that was the final nail. If he had any Christian faith or belief at that point, it was gone after that. And just my personal feeling on it, I get the sense that he blamed God. Perhaps he didn't, but that's just kind of the feeling that I had on it. So he did a lot of study, and he actually covered a lot of topics. It wasn't just about human evolution and stuff like that. He did some books on plants and other topics of the same kind of natural selection and stuff like that. But really, probably the two books that he was the most noted for were, first off, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. And then following that, there was another book he did called The Descent of Man. There's a little more to those titles. The one that's interesting to point out, because a question that a lot of people have brought up, and I myself have thought and questioned, was Darwin himself a racist? Now, there's arguments to be made on both sides of it. I've heard a lot of people say that they don't think that he himself was a racist, but that a lot of the teaching that he did and the books that he wrote were taken by people that were pretty egregious racists, and they really ran with it and took it to the next level. I actually contend that he was a racist, and one of the evidences that I give to that, I'll give a couple, but one of them is, if you look at, and this is something you don't always hear about, the full title of that big book of his. So it wasn't just On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. If you actually look at the full title of it, a little bit underneath the big stuff, it's On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Still not proof that he was a racist. I contend that it's some circumstantial evidence pointing in that direction. But like I said, whether he was or wasn't, it absolutely was a work of literature that was adopted by many people that were major racists. And a topic I'm going to touch on tying to this is the connection of the theory of evolution and racism, because to me they go hand in hand. My opinion, to me they go hand in hand, and the connection that has to communism. But a couple of quotes from Charles Darwin himself. I think these were, one may have been in On the Origin of Species, and the other one was in The Descent of Man, or they were both in The Descent of Man. But he was noted as saying, the first one is, "At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races." Now, I actually had a conversation with someone about this, and the idea came up. I said, okay, well, maybe what we're talking about here is more sociological than anything. That, poor countries or war-torn countries and stuff wouldn't survive, and the more civilized, technologically advanced, technologically evolved species or nations would be the ones to thrive and prosper, and they would kind of absorb or replace those other ones. And maybe that could be. However, when I throw the second comment in there, I think it really crystallizes the point that no, this is not a sociological thing. This is an evolutionary thing, which is what he was talking about. That man descended from ape, ultimately from the primordial soup that rained on rocks for millions of years, and so on and so forth. But the second quote, and this one, to me, is a lot more overtly racist. And it's a quote where he says, "At the same time, the anthropomorphous apes will no doubt be exterminated. The break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider, even than the Caucasian and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of as now between the Negro or Australian Aborigine and the gorilla." That's not sociological. So, to me, I mean, there's more things that could be said, but I think that really kind of sums up where his mindset was as he's working on these books. And that what he talks about in both of those books is fueled by racism. And I contend, I can't prove it, I contend, a hatred for God after the death of his daughter. So, I got to stop and make one point that right out of the gate, there should be a distinction made between types of evolution. I do believe in some evolution, but what we're talking about here, and what he was talking about in his books, was what I would refer to as macroevolution, and that's where you see one animal turning into another animal. Now, there's another variant of that called microevolution. This is something that I completely believe in, and that is variations within a kind. So things will adapt and change based on the living conditions that they're in. Dogs, are one of the classic examples that are frequently used in very cold environments, will tend to adapt to have longer hair. If they're in very hot environments, they will adapt to have shorter hair. But they're all dogs. Right? So it's not changing from one animal to another. Wolves are still part of the canine family. They're still part of that same family. Similar idea with horses and zebras and mules and stuff like that, that they're ultimately all part of the same family, but there are variations within that kind. So again, like one thing, I try not to speak too definitively because I'm really not an expert in a lot of this stuff. But one thing I will be so bold as to say is I don't believe that there has ever been a shred of evidence of one animal becoming another animal. For one thing, by their own explanation, the process would take too long for us to really even have been able to record it yet, right? But above and beyond that, we've had many, many reports where they have talked about the missing link. And I'm using humans as the specific example here. Because I did touch on that one comment where I mentioned the Australian Aborigine. The Aborigines at one time were absolutely viewed. They were identified them as, we have found the missing link that takes us from our common human form, which the evolved version of was the Caucasian, right? Blonde hair, blue-eyed, Caucasian. And we have found the missing link as this evolutionary throwback that looks very similar to monkeys and gorillas in the Australian outback, this group of people. I contend that these people look different because of the environments that they're living in, cause those variations to occur. Now, the other thing is, does it take thousands or millions of years for those variations to occur? No, I don't think the evidence shows that scientifically. And following the biblical narrative of the young earth, which I do follow, the idea that as of the Great Flood, which would have been round about 4,500 years ago, pretty much all people were wiped out, save Noah and his family. It's actually another one that kind of connects to the whole anti-racism thing. I don't see how racism can work in the Bible, because ultimately we're all descendants of one of Noah's children coming off the ark. And before that, we're all descendants of Adam and Eve. So we share very much a common heritage, and that the differences, again, come about because of the environments that we're living in, just out of sheer necessity. So they contend to have found this missing link in the Aborigines. Then they have Lucy, which I think, if I remember right, that one turned out to be a full-on hoax where they had combined, I don't know if it was intentional or inadvertent, but I think it was intentional. They had combined different types of bones. So the jaw was from a gorilla, but then the other bones were from a human, and they'd mix and match and create this and called it the missing link. So the actual hardcore evidence has never been found. I contend it never will be found because there is no such thing. We did not evolve over billions of years, in my opinion. We were created by a loving God who created us in the likeness of Elohim. Again, all descended from Adam and Eve, and by extension further on, one of the children of Noah as they disembarked from the ark after the great flood that wiped everything out due to wickedness. And so, yeah, just really that idea that there isn't any concrete evidence for it. And this ties back to that earlier point where what I had been taught was that this was concrete, right? Maybe not even specifically that topic, but it's just like, if you can show that that is not hardcore proven, what else isn't hardcore proven? A couple, just very quick examples. Fossilization does not take nearly as long as they say that it has. In fact, I think a recent study was done where they were able to simulate or create a fossilization effect in a 24-hour period in a lab. They really had to set up the framework to do it, but that they were able to pull this off in a day. They created a fossil. So it doesn't take millions of years to do that. There was a great story about a fella. This old fella had passed away, and he was buried, and a few years later his wife passed away, and so they were digging up where he was buried, or it was in a mausoleum or a tomb of some kind, and they were going to put her with him in this tomb. And when they went in to go see, apparently a bunch of water had been in there, had been running through, and they found him fossilized. That only took, a handful of years. So it's just a lot of things that they pass off as being definitively, factually proven, scientific facts that aren't in fact as factual as they say. And a lot of it stems back, the idea of evolution in millions of years. Darwin didn't come up with that idea. Right? I guess that's a big one to note. He didn't invent the millions and billions of years. He used it, And that's another interesting point, is he used it as part of his work. But if you actually look back at a lot of what was taught in public schools in particular, and in various textbooks, you'll see that over the years, the amount of time has significantly increased. I think I heard someone say at one point it was at a rate of like 22,000 years every year or something like that. The amount of time for evolution to occur. And that's always been the rescuing device of evolution, is given enough time that these things would happen. And given how much time that it would theoretically take, there's no way to measure that or record it, so we don't know. It's a theory. It has always been a theory of evolution. It always will be, and I don't think it's an accurate theory. Now, I do want to take a moment and let's talk on how this connects to communism. So here's 3 names, and anybody that is familiar with their history should recognize these pretty quickly. Karl Marx, Vladimir Lenin, and Joseph Stalin. Who are those 3 people, and what do they have in common? Ding, 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 ding. They are all Russian and are the fathers of communism in Russia. And potentially, I would say communism, anywhere that communism is, really kind of originated from them. All 3 of them heavily cite Darwin's works as a heavy influence point changing what they believed. I think, if I'm not mistaken, Karl Marx himself is actually Jewish or part Jewish, but renounced that at any rate. He really wasn't acting the part. He just plays one on TV. But they all embraced the idea of evolution. And if you go to China or to Russia, they are countries that really have blacklisted and maybe all but banned Christianity. It's very controlled. And I don't even know how much, because it's hard to get information in and out, nor do I have a great access point to find the information. But I have heard from enough people that it's very heavily controlled, and it's down to, because I've heard stories of people having to smuggle Bibles into China, and the Orthodox Church in Russia is not operating autonomously. I'll say that. So they have fully embraced the evolutionary teachings in millions and billions of years. And it reflects in how they treat people. Because, and this is kind of getting back to that idea of racism, when you have one group of people that believe that they are superior to another group of people, as is human tendency, violence, disrespect, segregation, all of these things, they really have no choice but to happen. And we can see a lot of examples of this. Individuals like Idi Amin and Pol Pot and Stalin and other people like that. I mean, one of the penultimate on that is Hitler, right? None of these people were Christians. They all believed in the theory of evolution. Hitler took it a whole step further in using it to practice eugenics. Not everyone is aware of the fact that during World War II, as all of this stuff started happening with the Jewish people, it wasn't limited to that. He actually started with around exterminating like handicapped people, lame people, mentally feeble, whatever. I'm not sure what they were calling them at the time, but people with mental and physical disabilities. And also other blacks were another big target. And that's why Hitler was so upset at the Berlin Olympics when, I can't remember his name now. The black fella won the running. In fact, dominated it. And, you know, I think his comment at the time was something to the effect of, he's like, well, how do you expect my men to compete against an ape like that? You know, I mean, apes just move faster, right? An evolutionary comment at its very root. So they really latched onto that stuff. And eugenics, at its core, is that idea of not just believing that one group of people is superior over another, but actually putting it to practice to say, okay, well, if we want the right type of people to reproduce and to grow and to become bigger and better, we need to get rid of the inferior ones. So that is at the very core of eugenics. And Hitler is not the only person to believe that. There's an American individual, for not wanting to have issues with the video, I'm not going to get into that. But yeah, not the only one to subscribe to the concept of eugenics and weeding out the inferior, less desirables from amongst us. If you look back at early church history, there is a lot of racist, anti-Semitic as well, but just racist in general comments. I mean, anti-Semitism really ties to it predominantly because so much of Christianity and Yeshua, Jesus, and all that, it did come from the Jews. I mean, Jesus was a Jew, right? His disciples were all Jews, and a lot of their early disciples were Jews. I mean, this is where it started. So there had to be really a forced separation from that, which I contend is racist in its nature, because it's saying one group of people is superior over another. Now, how did this, like, if we look at the effect of communism now, and taking it back specifically to evolution, it really is an idea that we arose by chemical chance. That we ultimately, human beings and our physical form are a chemical accident. And we are evolved from another chemical accident and the animals, right? A comment I've made frequently is we sit there and we're sending our kids into a public school system where they're being taught that they're nothing but animals and really have no value and have no meaning, no purpose, and you're just evolved from animals. And then we're sitting there wondering why they're going out and acting like animals. I think this all stems from the same thing. And Charles Darwin and his On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life, is a huge piece of that puzzle. Not the only piece, but a huge piece of it. And so I do just note again that idea that really when you have that kind of viewpoint, there is no value to life. Not inherently. You can do things that are of value in that kind of mindset. I remember thinking as an evolutionist that at some point I was going to be dead and just be worm food and be gone, and that's it. And if I didn't do something profound in my life, I wouldn't be remembered by anyone. I would just be gone, you know. And on the flip side of that, in the biblical worldview, as a child of God, as a creation of God, that we are here for a reason. We are here for a purpose. And this is one thing I love to start with when I'm talking to people sometimes is you're not an accident. You have a purpose. You're supposed to be here. You are infinitely more valuable than I think you realize. That's a shift I had to understand for me, but that's all of us. And if you sit there and anyone that murders someone, this is such an oddball reference. This really is an oddball reference, but I'm going to make it because it did stand out to me. So there's a movie that came out some time ago, a Clint Eastwood movie called The Unforgiven. And there was a line in that movie that was so poignant. And there's a couple of lines in different movies that did that to me. I mean, another quick example is in The Matrix when Morpheus makes a statement like, because I think they're asking him, well, why don't you just go and save everyone? Why do you need Keanu Reeves' character, right, Neo? And his answer is, well, there's ultimately, I'm paraphrasing a bit, but there's a difference between knowing the way and walking the way, right? That he knew the way, but he wasn't able to walk it. And this other character was able to. Anyways, back to the whole reference to the Unforgiven. There's a young gunman who there's a contract to go after someone for a crime, something they had done. And he enlists the help of this old killer, played by Clint Eastwood. And he's pretending to be all hot and fancy and everything, but he's never actually killed anyone. So on their road to going to accomplish what it is they're trying to do, he does end up killing someone. It's the first person he's ever killed. And it traumatizes him badly. And he's like, I can't do this. I can't keep going. How do you manage, right? I can't follow through with this. And this old aged killer, played by Clint Eastwood, his response is what's so profound, right? And he says, killing a man is a hell of a thing. You take away everything that he ever was and everything that he ever will be. And that really jumped out at me. You're not just talking about a physical body with 2 arms and 2 legs wearing some clothes walking around. This is a person. They have parents. Many times they have spouses, they have children, they have siblings, they have friends, they have co-workers, they have an influence on the environment around them and the people that they're interacting with. Maybe more importantly, they have hopes and they have dreams. Everyone, even the ones that drive around like buffoons and, even the chain smoking, and you pick all the vices, pick all the different, they are still people that have a past and have a future. Sadly, in many cases, they don't do anything with that future. And that's unfortunate, but they have the opportunity, thanks to God. But they're people, right? They're not just some freak chemical accident that doesn't mean anything or fulfill a purpose other than to just use up resources and take up air, right? So we need to reduce whatever percentage of the population some of these people think, right? That's another topic I'm not going to get into, but I don't think that the world is overpopulated. That's my opinion. My uninformed, uneducated opinion. And I think once that was a big shift for me, because when I believed the evolutionary way of stuff, I really didn't place a lot of value on others. I think just naturally fell into being, I've talked previously about how in my previous life I was a thief. I was also a chronic liar. And I don't think you do those things without having very much a lack of respect and consideration for other people, because all of those things, yes, violating someone else can be a sexual thing, as is often attributed, and rightly so, to rape. But violation like that is not limited to that. It can just be a betrayal of words. It can be that chronic lying. It can be taking something from them that maybe you didn't know had, extremely high sentimental value that was very, very important to them. And now it's gone, and you have violated them in that respect. I mean, people talk about a lot of times their house gets broken into, and what the sense of violation that was, that their privacy, their personal space has been invaded. So you don't do that without having a disregard for others. And thankfully, that's one of the big things that's changed in me, is I now have this appreciation and value for all of God's children. Some I need to pray for more than others, that they would get their heads out of their tushes and make their way back to the person that created them. But we're all children of God, whichever path we're on, whether you're on the broad road or the narrow road, whether you're an atheist, or you're all children of God, right? And you have the free will to choose to reject God and not believe in him, but it doesn't mean you're not a child of God, in my viewpoint. And that's why truly now, I look at people, I look at things, and I can absolutely, with conviction, speak to hate the sin, not the sinner. And that's that shift away. But when you believe in evolution, when you believe those things, I'm not saying you can't be following the law, you can't be a morally upright person. I would contend that that moral uprightness and what the difference is between right and wrong is not inherent in an evolutionary viewpoint. That comes from God. Evolution has had to borrow from him to have the social constructs of what's right and wrong. In a purely evolutionary viewpoint, again, we're all a chemical accident. I can just decide for myself what is right and wrong. So I could decide that I want to take your stuff. I can decide that I'm going to kill you. And that's right to me, right? Because we can ascend to be our own gods. And that actually is going to kind of connect me to the last part of this that I wanted to touch on. But, yeah, so as I start to wrap this up, and hopefully it hasn't been too long-winded, there's some real dangers to evolution, and it's not limited to, but maybe one of the biggest is racism. Because I contend once again, racism cannot exist in an actual biblical, godly worldview. We're all children of God. We're all descended from Noah. We're all descended from Adam and Eve, but we're all related. And it's just a question of, really, you look at someone that's white and say, we're not actually white. It's a difference of how much melanin we have in our skin that affects our tone based on the environments that we're living in. As a protection mechanism, you adapt. You adapt to survive in the environment that you're in. And that selection process is true, right? But again, changing from one animal to another, no evidence of it. And I will go out on a limb and say that there is no evidence of one animal turning into another animal. And every time they think they come up with something, they'll either find an error with it, or, like I said, in the most extreme cases, it's a full-on hoax, but there's no evidence. So, as I start to summarize, I guess the first point that I would like to make is that this concept of evolution and evolving like this, it truly is nothing new. It truly is nothing new. It has been around, I contend, pretty much since the beginning of creation. And to that effect, I am actually going to open up a Bible, and I am going to read a passage, because ultimately my contention with that is that we see one of the first, if not the first, evidence of evolution right in the book of Genesis in the Bible. And it's Hasatan. It is the devil. It is the adversary doing it. And it's when Adam and Eve are in the garden. And, well, let's just read it. So it's I'm going to be reading from Genesis chapter 3. And it'll run from verses 1 through verse 7. So, let's read this. And in this case, I am reading from the King James, if anyone wants to follow along. So, Genesis 3, 1 through 7. Now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said unto the woman, Yea, hath God said, Ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden? Right there, what is Satan doing? He's saying, call into question God's authority. Right? Did he say that? Did he really mean that? Could there be something else? And the woman said unto the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God hath said, Ye shall not eat of it, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die. And the serpent said unto the woman, Ye shall not surely die, for God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and, here it is, one of, if not the origin of evolution, ye shall be as gods. knowing good and evil. And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof, and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat. And the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together, and made themselves aprons. But that line right there, ye shall be as gods. You can decide for yourself what is right and wrong. You are getting bigger and better and smarter and stronger. Yet it's funny because when you actually look at the world and what's going on nowadays, we're actually breaking down. Because I guess you have to kind of follow part of the Bible to look at this. But originally, we were supposed to live forever. Then we sinned and fell from grace. And now, all of a sudden, we were only living to be 900 and something years old. I think the oldest we have in biblical record is Methuselah, who was like, oh boy, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, 963 years old. I think it was something pretty close to that. And from there, it dropped down to, you can see by the time we get to Noah, he lived to be about 600 years old. Then they lived to be about 400 years old, then 200 years old. And now, not many of us make it to 100. And with the rise in a lot of things, but our environment, poor diet, lack of exercise, just a whole bunch of things compounding together, we are just getting sicker and more frail as time goes on. And we are propping that up with the medical advancements that we have made. But believe me, if we weren't utilizing the technology that we do have, there wouldn't even be many making it to 60 or 70. There's always going to be exceptions, but I think you see the trend, and it's very much a downhill trend. I look back on another element to schooling and education in the 1800s. And this one fella, they're part of a site, what was it called, Wall Builders? But they gave an example of a grade 4 test from the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s. And this was like college level stuff nowadays. Nobody could answer, very few could answer the questions on a grade 4 test. And that really just illustrates the deterioration of the public school system. And we know for a fact that there's been times where they've downgraded the requirements to pass SATs and stuff like that, just because we've gotten far from getting smarter and better, we've gotten dumber and slower. And so evolution can try to pass off these ideas, and then they sugarcoat it and they will cover it with all this makeup and, fancy stuff, but it's still rotting. It's still decaying. It's not getting bigger and better. It's heading the other way. And there is going to come a time when, as it says, I think in Thessalonians, the dead will be raised and given incorruptible forms, and that we that are alive and remain will be caught up with them and live forevermore with the Lord. So we're not going to die. We're not going to have illness or disease. So there is a time when things are going to get better and we are going to improve. Or in fact, we're going to become perfect as we're remade for eternity with Yeshua and God. So amen. We can all look forward to that. And I think on that note, I will wrap it up. So two things that I wanted to reiterate. Well, reiterate one and then just leave with a closing statement. So the reiteration is the idea that evolution is the cause of a lot of problems in the world, not the least of which is racism, which is a huge one. And that my statement that I will wrap up with is that I have believed, really even before I was a believer, but certainly reaffirmed and confirmed after I became a believer, there is only one race. That is the human race. And I don't care what color your skin is personally. I will judge you by the content of your character, not by the color of your skin, or by the type of clothes you wear, or by what country you live in, or by what language you speak. right? I want to know who you are, not what you are, because that's what's important to me, from one child of God to another. On that note, I will wrap it up. If you stuck through to the end of this one, I thank you very much. I really appreciate you being here. I do ask if you give the video a thumbs up, share, comment below, try to keep it respectful, or you can email us. And all of that information will follow the video, and you can find in the description in the link below. Once again, I thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. I wish blessings to you, that you have a good day, Shavua Tov, have a good week, and may God make his face shine upon you and bless you. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Truth and Testimony, the broadcast. If you have a comment, please leave it on the bottom of this video or email us at truthandtestimonyemail@gmail.com. Again, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Truth and Testimony, the broadcast is not affiliated with Truth and Testimony magazine.